Hello, hello. Well, it's really wonderful to have so many people joining us today. Thank you all for being here. My name is Eliza Canty-Jones, and I'm on staff at the Oregon Historical Society, who is a proud partner in this series of programs, New Scholarship in Jewish History in Oregon and the American West. This is a 6-part series, and today's presentation is the second. We kicked off last week with an outstanding talk by Professor Ellen Eisenberg on rethinking Oregon Jewish pioneers. So thanks very much, Ellen, for that. Additional programs in the series will take place each Wednesday through February 15th. You can register for the series or for individual programs at ohs.org or ojmche.org. And your registration will include a link to access the program recordings, which will be available after the end of the series. So the real organizer of this series is the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education, which explores the legacy of the Jewish experience in Oregon, teaches the enduring and universal relevance of the Holocaust, and provides opportunities for intercultural conversations. All of us here at the Oregon Historical Society are so grateful for the knowledge and leadership that OJMCHE provides to our community. From exhibitions to public programs to educational work with teachers and students, the organization provides valuable opportunities for learning and for community building and for drawing on history to transform the future. So we want to thank you to all of the staff members, volunteers, and members who make that work possible. And thanks, of course, to all of the OHS members who are joining us on the program today as well. Today's program title is Rightlandia, Walter Huss and the Long History of the Far Right in Oregon, 1955 to 2005. The subject of this talk, of course, is relevant not only here in Oregon, but across the United States. Many of us have watched carefully over the past 2 weeks as the far right wing of the Republican Party has gained really significant power in the US House of Representatives, where members of that right wing who hold extreme views successfully negotiated. We're now seeing really significant concessions from now Speaker Kevin McCarthy, who's beginning to deliver on those promises that he made. Professor Cotlar's research delves into the long history of far-right factions here in Oregon during the 20th century, and his talk will build on that research to address the question of how Walter Huss's story helps us understand the rise of grassroots right-wing populism from the 1960s through the present. So if you have questions for Dr. Cotlar, please put those in the Q&A, and I'll come back on after his presentation to send those questions to him. So please put those in whenever you feel like it. You won't interrupt anything. So as they come to mind, put those in the Q&A box. So Seth Cotlar is a professor of history at Willamette University in Salem, Oregon. He is currently working on an article with the same title as today's presentation. He teaches courses on the history of the far right and the history of American conservatism. His first book was Tom Paine's America, The Rise and Fall of Transatlantic Radicalism in the Early American Republic, which was published in 2011 by the University of Virginia Press, and it won the James Broussard Prize for the best first book for the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. He has also co-edited Historian in Chief, How Presidents Interpret the Past to Shape the Future, also published by the University of Virginia Press in 2019, and that was co-edited with Richard Ellis. So please join me in a warm but quiet virtual welcome for Professor Seth Cotlar. Thank you very much, Professor Cotlar.
Yeah, thanks for having me. All right, well, I'm just going to jump right in. I'm going to jump in with the top line headline story that I have discovered in my couple years of researching Walter Huss, which is this. In 1978, the Oregon Republican Party elected a chair who was a Holocaust-denying white Christian nationalist with ties to neo-Nazis and other far-right domestic terrorists that stretched from the 1950s into the 1990s. This is not what I expected to find when I started doing research on Walter Huss, but it is what I found. And I should say that, I mean, this would be shocking if we discovered this about the chair of any state's or state's Republican Party, but it's especially notable for Oregon in the sense that in the 1970s and 80s, the Oregon Republican Party was known for its moderation, as represented by figures like Mark Hatfield, Bob Packwood, Governor Tom McCall. So if there was ever any state Republican Party that you would think would be immune to the takeover by the far right, it would have been Oregon. But that's not the way it worked out. So here's the structure of today's talk. First, I'm going to spend about 15 or 20 minutes just letting you know who Walter Huss is. I suspect most of you know very little about him. He doesn't have a Wikipedia entry. In an enormous 500-page book about the history of Oregon politics, Walter Huss gets 2 sentences in that book. So he's not a figure that many people know about. So I'll give you the basic information of his life. Second, then, I want to talk about the nature and extent of the conspiratorial anti-Semitism that lay at the core of his worldview from the 1950s into the early 2000s. Anti-Semitism wasn't just one menu item in the list of bigotries that Walter Huss embraced. It was the central organizing principle of his life. And third, then I'll talk about the broader historical significance of Huss's far-right activism. A common question that I get is like, well, this guy was a kook. He served for 9 months as the chair. The Oregon Republican Party wasn't that significant as an institution. Like, who cares? Why does this matter, right? And that's a legitimate question. So my basic answer, as outlined here, is that Huss was a cultivator, amplifier, and disseminator of a far-right, illiberal, populist, hyper-nationalistic, conspiracy-obsessed, apocalyptic, anti-government and anti-media political culture that mobilized a grassroots insurgency that slowly came to dominate the political culture of the Oregon GOP from the 1960s into the 21st century. And this happened despite the efforts of the more moderate establishment of the party to prevent it. So that, in my estimation, is why this matters. In so many ways, Mark Hatfield, Bob Packwood, and Tom McCall were the past of the Oregon Republican Party in the 1970s and 80s, and Walter Huss, for better or worse, represented the direction that the party, not as in its entirety, but it largely would head, which is in part why part of the reason why the party has been so electorally unsuccessful, I would argue, since the 1980s. Okay. So who was Walter Huss? So Huss grew up, he's a native Oregonian. He grew up in Portland, son of a janitor, so grew up working class in Portland, Southeast Portland. He went to fight in World War II, and then he came back, trained for the ministry in Los Angeles through the Foursquare Church associated with Amy Semple McPherson in the late 1940s. Then by his own account, his life was transformed permanently in 1955 when he attended a Christian anti-communist crusade led by Fred Schwartz. Some of you might remember Fred Schwartz from the 1960s and 1970s. Fred Schwartz was probably the leading, he picked up the mantle left behind by Joe McCarthy. Right? And Fred Schwartz gave anti-communism a kind of friendlier face, one that was more respectable. He would appear on television quite frequently. He would hold events in Los Angeles where Ronald Reagan, John Wayne, Dale Rogers, or Dale Evans and Roy Rogers would show up. And he wrote a ton of books, issued all these newsletters, and he was active from the 50s into the 90s. His most famous book is the one you see on the left there, You Can Trust the Communists to Be Communists. This is an updated edition that he co-authored with David Nobel. His name may be familiar to you because he wrote a book in 1966 proving that the Beatles' music was hypnotic and was intended to turn the people who listened to it into communists. So David Nobel worked with Billy James Hargis as his right-hand man. David Nobel currently leads the Christian Anti-Communist Crusade. If you Google it, you can see him there. He's been an advisor to Michelle Bachmann and other kind of contemporary conservatives. Now, and Fred Schwartz was, as you see on the right, interviewed on Firing Line by Bill Buckley in 1967. And it was a very friendly interview. Buckley thought that Fred Schwartz was doing great work to expose the danger of communism in America. So this is the figure who, for Huss, is kind of his pole star, right? Someone from whom he learned and regards as his kind of hero. Okay. So in 1960, Walter Huss settled in Portland permanently. And eventually he purchased a house at 23rd and Belmont where he lived his entire life. the way he introduced himself to Portland is by holding an anti-communist crusade, similar to what Fred Schwartz did. He had Herb Philbrick come, who was the guy whose life I Led 3 Lives was based on. And he gave a talk at the Civic Auditorium, downtown Portland. Huss organized this school of anti-communism at the Multnomah Bible College. This is just the beginning of a lifelong relationship that he had with Multnomah Bible College. So this was his first sort of introduction to Portland. Between 1960 and 1965, most of Huss's time was devoted to running kind of political educational meetings at his Freedom Center at 23rd and Belmont. Usually the attendance would be around 20 or 30 people, mostly folks from the kind of far eastern part of Portland, generally older, always white, and often evangelicals. So he did that. He organized tours, speaking tours around the state of Oregon for speakers and also films. So Operation Abolition, which was a very sort of famous John Birch Society kind of anti-communist film. Walter Huss went around the state showing it in schools and churches and so on. He also published a monthly newspaper, as well as reams of right-wing leaflets and flyers like the ones you can see here, showing how UNESCO is destroying the family, communists are going to conquer the US, the ACLU wants to cancel Christmas, etc. And he would sell these. This is a way that he would make money. He had a printing operation in the basement of his house. He also published, he also had a weekly radio show that aired on several stations around the state. And he also staged various protests in Portland. He was kind of a precocious troll in a way. And then whenever, so for example, when MLK came to speak in Portland, Huss showed up to protest MLK's speech because MLK was presumably a communist, as Walter Huss saw it. Okay. So in 1964, Walter Huss, you won't be surprised to hear, was very excited about Barry Goldwater's candidacy. He thought this was a great sign for the Republican Party, that it was moving in the right direction. And he wrote a campaign song with his friend James Bissell, who is the man pictured on the right. James Bissell was Oregon's leading Christian ventriloquist who had a dummy named Tony. That's Tony on his lap there. I was able to track down one of the only 2 extant copies of this song. And so I'm just going to play a tiny little bit of it just so you get the flavor of it. Walter Huss is the guy singing the harmonies.
Let us return to freedom springs from which our forefathers drank, and we will all give a cheer to one on whom we can bank. America, America, the gold rush is on. Goldwater, greatest choice we've had since Lincoln. Goldwater, every freedom lover's thinking Goldwater, the man to lead our land. All America's taking a stand for them.
You can now all curse me for having that earworm in your ear now for the next.
Return.
Okay. So now of great assistance in getting a handle on Huss's career before 1965 is the work of Scott McNall. This is his book pictured on the left here. Now, McNall was an undergraduate at Portland State in 1961, and he encountered Walter Huss at a counter-protest to Martin Luther King. And McNall was planning on going to graduate school to get a degree in sociology, and he was interested in the far right. And he thought, this is great. I can study this group right here in Oregon. And so he asked Walter Huss if he could kind of embed himself in the organization. He did not lie to Walter Huss about who he was. He was genuinely curious about Huss's operation, and so Huss agreed. And so basically his 1965 University of Oregon dissertation, which became this book published in 1975, is a participant observer study of the Freedom Center in Portland. And it's a tremendous piece of work. And Professor McNall is still with us. He was gracious enough to talk with me on the phone a couple times, and I learned a lot from him and from his experience. So the next major stage in Huss's career after Goldwater was in 1968. And that's when he went around the state encouraging ultra-conservative evangelicals like himself to run for precinct captain positions and then come to the state GOP convention to elect Huss as their chair, thereby booting out of the GOP establishment, or booting out the GOP establishment that Huss regarded as, so liberal that they were basically communists. And it's been hard finding evidence of how he did this, but I stumbled upon this amazing piece in Huss's archive that Huss owned, which is why it's all marked up. And this is an account from Norman Crowhurst from Curry County, and this is from his self-published spiritual autobiography entitled Victory Over the Beast's Image from 1981. Crowhurst is a fascinating guy in and of himself. He's from Scotland, moved to rural Oregon, published about 30 books on acoustical engineering and mathematics textbooks that are very well regarded. And he also was the chairperson of the Curry County Republican Party. So I'm going to read it. Here's Crowhurst's account of how Walter Huss tried to do this work to take over the Republican Party. In 1968, while I was county chairman of the Curry County Republican Central Committee, I received a long phone call from a man who identified himself as Walter Huss, a preacher with the Church of God. He was using a Watts line, so kept me on the phone for 45 minutes that time and over an hour another time. The gist of the conversation was God had told him to take over the Republican Party and that God had told him that I was his man in Curry County. The time was spent explaining the strategy several times over because I could not accept it as the Christian thing to do. When he said God had told him I was to take over the party in Curry County, I had two objections. First, if God had told him that, why hadn't God told me himself? And no, I wasn't being facetious. In my previous experience, if God had something for me to do, he revealed it to me, not through some third party. And second, I was already county chairman. In what way was I to take over from myself? It seemed I was to become a dictator and railroad whatever he said, quote, had to be done without reference to the elected committeemen and women. That was trickery. Come party convention time, Huss's plan was to get a slate of officers, all from his church, elected by skillful strategy. As soon as I arrived at the convention hotel, one of his henchmen told me Huss wanted to see me in his inner sanctum, a suite of rooms on the top floor that he had set up for the purpose. I was ushered in like a VIP, and he explained the strategy to me. And then Crowhurst explains how he was like, no, I'm not going to do this. This is completely inappropriate. I'm not going to participate in this. So this is Crowhurst again. He had given his orders, and all any of us peons had to do was to obey them. They were God's orders transmitted through him. So in 1968, Huss failed to win this election, to be the chair of the Oregon Republican Party. And then he returned in 1970, in 1972, in 1974, in 1976. And then finally in 1978, it worked and he won. So many establishment Republicans, I've listened to many Oregon Historical Society oral histories, and in almost all of them, I mean, people rarely talk about Huss. And when they do, they're like, yeah, man, that guy came out of nowhere. We have no idea how this happened. And I'm sorry, either you're like selectively forgetting something, that he was there at the convention every year from 1968 until 1978 with his little inner sanctum doing his thing, trying to like rile up votes. There is no possible way that people in the Oregon Republican Party did not know what Huss was up to. Regardless, it came as a surprise to sort of everyone. Immediately, the establishment Republicans set up a counter organization called the Committee of Elected Republicans, which basically functioned as a way for people to give money to the Republican Party without giving it to Huss. And it was kind of a mess. Within 9 months, Huss is kicked out. I'm not clear on how exactly that process worked out, and I hope to eventually find out more about that. Okay. Now for Huss, this moment from August of 1978 until the spring of 1979 is the absolute pinnacle of his career. He flew to Washington, D.C. for national meetings with the Republican National Convention, where he met a host of Republican luminaries. He was interviewed by Pat Robertson on the 700 Club. He had his 30 minutes of fame on the 700 Club. And he met with congressmen like Barry Goldwater and Larry McDonald, who was a John Birch Society member who was killed in the Korean Airlines flight in 1983, which you can imagine how the John Birch Society interpreted the meaning of that. Back in Oregon, when Huss won in 1978, it led to this kind of sudden interest of, well, wait, who is this guy? How did this happen? Where did he come from? And then those folks, both establishment Republicans and people in the media, got a hold of Scott McNall's dissertation and his book and got in touch with him to try to bring to light. And through this, they brought to light some of the aspects of Huss's extremism from the early 1960s. So one piece of Huss's story that now looks even more significant in hindsight has to do with his ties to two young men who had been active participants in Huss's Freedom Center, and then in 1965 decided to shave their heads and start wearing swastikas around Portland, and they became full-blown neo-Nazis. Now, Huss was asked about these guys who had ties to him, and he kind of shrugged it off and said, well, you know, they don't like Jews, I don't like coffee, was his response. And his claim was that this is just guilt by association. People are trying to tar him with this connection, and that's not fair. He's not responsible for what these young men do. As we'll see, there was a lot more to be uncovered that even McNall did not have access to. Huss, when I asked Scott McNall about Huss's anti-Semitism, he was like, yeah, it doesn't surprise me, but I didn't really hear him talk that much about it. Okay, it is worth noting, however, that McNall, after he filed his dissertation in 1965, he asked for it to be embargoed. He told me that he started always having a gun with him because he feared for his safety. And he looked for a job out of state, which he successfully acquired and moved to Minnesota and breathed a sigh of relief because he feared for his own safety as to what would happen when his dissertation became known to Walter Huss and his associates. Okay, so in 1979, Huss is done as chair of the Republican Party. He's kind of kicked to the curb. And then he settles into a life where his economic pursuits mostly involve being connected to multi-level marketing schemes, of which there are records from scores of them, perhaps even hundreds of them in his records. Some of them he was a lower level member, others he organized, and none of them did he seem to make all that much money, or when he did, it always seemed to come at the expense of other people. As with most multi-level marketing schemes. He also ran a health food / alternative medicine store at 23rd and Belmont, where he sold spirulina and whey powder and other supposed cures for cancer, probably to the kind of far-right populists like himself, as well as maybe some of the hippies who lived in East Portland. So he continues to work inside the Oregon GOP, however, at this time. He is very heavily involved with the Multnomah County Republican Party throughout the 80s and into the 90s. And he also occasionally flirts with some right-wing third parties like the American Independent Party, Populist Party, Constitutionalist Party, et cetera. So to fast forward, his last two significant public crusades involved first the effort to take MLK's name off of MLK Boulevard in 1989 and 1990, which failed. And then in the mid-90s, he worked to get ballot measures approved that would create a flat tax as the only source of state revenue. That ballot measure also failed. He also ran for governor in 1998 at the age of 80. And like every other time he ran for office, he did not even come close to winning. But it didn't stop him from pouring a ton of energy into the effort. Okay, so that's Huss's basic biography. Now, to some extent, he kind of looks like a familiar type, a socially conservative fundamentalist in the mold of someone like Billy James Hargis, Fred Schwartz, or a kind of new right activist like Richard Viguerie or maybe Jerry Falwell. But Huss's papers reveal a much darker side. So these are, this is a photo of the box that contained his two folders labeled Jews. I was starting this work during COVID and I could not get into the U of O library. They would not open the library for me to come look at it. And so I knew those folders were there for about 8 months before I could look at them. Finally got in to look at them. And so I had it built up in my mind, all these ideas about like what might be there. And it was like 20 times worse than I ever kind of imagined what would be there. So this is just a sampling. It's basically the greatest hits of anti-Semitic literature from the 20th century. And most of it is pretty heavily annotated by him. It's clear that he read this and sort of paid close attention to it. The envelope there is from the Institute for Historical Review, which was the leading Holocaust denial outlet that was run by neo-Nazis. And he received a ton of information, mail, et cetera, from them. He was on their mailing list. On the right is something that he wrote in his own handwriting. And it says this is from 1982. They commit the act. I simply stated the fact. If they would abide by the Judeo ethic, people wouldn't hate them so much. They force themselves upon you and take over as much as they can. They bring on their own persecution. And that, I think, nicely sums up Walter Huss's ideas about Jewish people. Another place to see the nature of Huss's anti-Semitism is this is a legal brief that he filed in 1986. Long story, he had been busted for importing Brazilian bark tea that he claimed cured cancer, but which did not, and so was not legal under the FDA's rules to import. And he was caught doing this, fined $30,000. And of course, and this is his interpretation, his claim as to why this unjust thing had been done to him. And I'll just read parts of this. The reason for this attack against the Husses is obvious. So this is being written by his lawyer, who was also a kind of sovereign citizen type far-right guy who also was an Elvis impersonator who played piano at a Mexican restaurant at Clinton and 23rd or 20th back in the day. Anyway, so the reason for this attack against the Husses is obvious. Walter Huss has been outspoken against the political philosophy of communism ever since 1960, when he held his anti-communist school in Portland, Oregon, at which Herbert Philbrick, the man who led 3 Lives, remember the TV show, and Fred C. Schwartz, a world expert on communism, were guest lecturers. For those who don't know what communism is, I will define it. It is the upper class elite Jewish philosophy of and plan for the global subjugation and conquest of Gentiles, non-Jews, and common Jews, and the extermination of monotheistic Jews, race purification by animal husbandry. Religion not controlled by the state makes it difficult for the state to make slaves of the people. In the political world, there is no tolerance allowed for, quote, division of the house from within. When one elite Jew looks another elite Jew in the eye, he wants to know that he is not dealing with a theist, but a material realist and a secular humanist. By the way, David Nobel, one of his big books in the 80s was about the danger of secular humanism. Any other product of animal husbandry is regarded as racial degeneration, so on and so forth. Oregon and the Pacific Northwest are coming under the rule of a materialistic Jewish elite referred to by some persons as the Jewish mafia. The Husses, by teaching the public about the effect of communism on our society, have made it more difficult for the Jewish mafia to take over the control of the Pacific Northwest. And so members of the Jewish mafia entrenched in offices of the US government and on media staff have made a special point of harassing and defrauding the Husses at every opportunity that avails itself or that they can create. In other words, Walter Huss has been treated very unfairly by the terrible communists in the media, in the press, and the deep state who are out to get him. Okay. Huss, I think hopefully we're beyond the point of disputing whether Walter Huss was an anti-Semite. I think it's fairly clear. That's just one example of hundreds I could give you from his archives. So where does this come from? Right? And I think, we tend to think of, or not, I won't speak for all of you. Oftentimes in our public culture, anti-Semitism is seen as a form of ignorance, right? As an absence of ideas or an absence of information, as a form of ignorance. But instead, I think we should think of it as an overabundance of just bad ideas, of wrong ideas that are fleshed out in innumerable books and pamphlets that Huss had in his possession. So this far-right populist, conspiratorial popular culture was often invisible to those unfamiliar with it. It sounded like crazy talk, right, to someone like, say, Mark Hatfield or Bob Packwood or other folks, because it, and in part because it traveled under the kind of banner of Christian patriotism and anti-communism. So Huss could present himself to a reporter from the Oregonian or to other Republicans as someone who just hated communism and was a Christian who loved America and was a patriot. And people could say, oh, okay, cool. What he meant by that was that America was a Christian nation, Jews are a threat to it, and anyone else who isn't Christian in the same way that he's Christian. By the way, he hated all the mainline Protestant denominations in Oregon as well, right? So anyone who wasn't a Christian in the way that he was part of the Jewish conspiracy to undermine Christianity. and also was a threat to American society and civilization as he understood it. Okay, so I still have to do more work to figure out where this all came from. The earliest statement of this I find in his archive is from 1957, and it's unclear if that's in his words or not. But given that he was sort of studying for the ministry in Los Angeles, and I know where he lived in Los Angeles, which is exactly the same neighborhood where Gerald L.K. Smith and Wesley Swift and other Christian identity, Christian nationalist preachers were regularly preaching. I suspect that that's where he perhaps first encountered it. And in the early 1960s, he takes this guy, Kenneth Goff, on a tour of the state. Kenneth Goff was a fascist and a Holocaust denier and a Christian domestic terrorist who was involved with the Minutemen of Robert Depew. And so Huss took Kenneth Goff, his friend, on a tour through Oregon. In a letter as late as 1988, Walter Huss and a friend are reminiscing about how great it was when Kenneth Goff came to Oregon to give his talks. This is 25 years later. So this was clearly a moment in Huss's life that he did not look back upon with any regret whatsoever. He saw it as a great accomplishment that he did of introducing Kenneth Goff to the people of Oregon. Okay. Huss also got this information through his media diet. So the Spotlight was his favorite media outlet that he recommended to other people quite frequently. This is just one edition from 1976. Ronald Reagan wrote a piece for it that was responding to some criticisms that had been made of him in the Spotlight. On the right is the war hero Pedro del Val, who was a fascist, who was on the board of directors for the National Youth Alliance, which was a neo-Nazi organization that spawned William Pierce, who was the author of the Turner Diaries. Interesting fun fact, there's actually still a Pedro del Val scholarship available to people in the Marines if they so want it. Hopefully it does not encourage people to be fascist like Pedro del Val. If one was reading the Spotlight, this is the sort of reading material that one could purchase. Walter Huss had many of these books in his library, and some of it was totally normal, like the Constitution or Washington's Farewell Address, the Great Tax Fraud, How to Write Your Congressman. But if you look on the right, you'll see other books for sale, like the ADL and its use in the World Communist Conspiracy, or The Myth of the 6 Million, or a book by Robert Depew, who was the head of the Minutemen, or Imperium, which was a book by Francis Yockey, who was a Nazi or an American sort of fascist. And that book, Imperium, is kind of like, it's like the Turner Diaries of the 1960s, that if you're a far-right fascist in America, of course you've read Francis Yockey. It's kind of a required reading. Okay. And here's just a partial list of the anti-Semitic or white power organizations or movements that Huss had ties with. Robert Depew's Minutemen, Gerald L.K. Smith's Christian Nationalist Crusade. Walter Huss was a subscriber to the Cross and the Flag, and his papers are filled with editions of it. The Posse Comitatus movement, the Christian Patriot Defense League, headed up by Jack Moore, who made the news in the 1980s because he gave a speech at the Aryan Nations compound, teaching people how to do guerrilla warfare. And then he was connected to the Order, which was the group that murdered Alan Berg, the Jewish radio host in Colorado. Huss has connections to the Institute for Historical Review, which was the Holocaust Denial outfit. He ties to the Liberty Lobby. The Liberty Lobby in DC was infamous for holding celebrations of Hitler's birthday every April 20th. He had ties to the National States' Rights Party, led by J.B. Stoner, which also engaged in various acts of domestic terrorism. He had tons of literature from the Sons of Liberty, which was a Louisiana white supremacist group in the 70s, 80s. He was a big fan of David Duke and subscribed to David Duke's National Association for the Advancement of White People newsletter. He even wrote a letter to David Duke, offering him dating advice. If you email me, I'll share it with you. It's also on Twitter. I put it on Twitter as well. He had connections to the Western Front, which was a Los Angeles area fascist organization with connections back into the 1930s even. He had material from the Northwest Imperative, which was connected to the Aryan nation's effort to build a white homeland in the Pacific Northwest. And he also had materials from William Potter Gale, Richard Butler, and the Aryan nations, et cetera. Okay. Another piece that I stumbled upon in my research is the fact that one of Walter Huss's newspapers from 1965 was in the possession of this guy named Joseph Dillis in Chicago. And Dillis was the sort of person who would go to the effort to have a stamp made up that said the words communism is Jewish, so that he could then take that stamp and stamp all of his materials with it. Dillis was kind of a notorious figure in Chicago. He had a newsstand in the Loop where he sold various forms of Nazi and far-right kind of literature. When Tom Metzger and other skinhead neo-Nazis went to have their appearance on the Oprah Winfrey Show in the early 90s, I believe it was, they made it a point to stop over at Joseph Dillis's house and spend some time with him because he was one of their heroes. Okay, so what do we make of all of this? Why does this matter? In the 2000, a scholar named Chip Berlet, who's a great scholar of far-right populism, produced this graphic that I think is, it's a lot of words on it, but I think it's very useful in understanding this worldview of Walter Huss. And he calls it right-wing producerism. And the idea is that Walter Huss and people like him are the real Americans, right? The good Christian, true Americans, the populists, can take various forms inside that circle there in the middle. To the right are these kind of far-right insurgents, the people who want to use violence to pursue their ends. And those people on the far right, these more white power, more explicitly violent groups, are looking towards these populists like Huss for recruits, right? For people to bring into their organization. And likewise, on the left, we see these politicians and electoral folks who see this kind of emerging popular culture of right-wing populism and see it as something that they can tap into to ride to electoral victory. Someone like David Duke or Pat Buchanan in the 90s is a good example of this, right? And Walter Huss spans all three of these categories, right? He had ties to the Posse Comitatus folks. There are lots of letters from various Posse Comitatus. My favorite letter is the one saying that Walter Huss is not a member of the Posse Comitatus, signed on the letterhead of the Posse Comitatus. Anyway, but Huss also had all of these ties to very kind of normal seeming Christians from churches around the state, right? Who perhaps would not have thought of themselves as wanting to be in cahoots with someone who was such a virulent anti-Semite, but who bought into other parts of his worldview. And an important component of this worldview is that it sees themselves as beset by parasites from both above and below, right? So there are elite parasites, usually associated with the Jews, but not solely, who are seen as these insiders, the bankers, the media elites, the Hollywood elites, et cetera, who hate the real Americans like you. And then there are the parasites from below, immigrants, people of color, et cetera, who are perceived to be sponging off of the producing good, virtuous people who are the real Americans. Okay. This, to my mind, is a perfect encapsulation of the way that Walter Huss saw the world from the beginning of his political career up to the end. And one thing I really want to emphasize is that this isn't just an Oregon story, right? This is a kind of Oregon outcropping of what is a national story. So what you see here is a picture depicting all of the radio stations in 1966 where you could hear far-right or neo-Nazi AM radio programming. That's a lot of dots. What you see here is a list of all of the literature circulated on the far-right, right-wing literature circulated in the mid-1960s. And what you'll note is that the National Review, which is the most kind of moderate or mainstream of all of these, is only third on the list, and is, if you add all the rest of it up, is quite dwarfed. And all of the other materials on here are either explicitly white supremacist, like the Counselor, which was the White Citizens Council of the South, or explicitly fascist, like the Liberty Letter, which was run by a neo-Nazi, the Defender, which was the Christian Defender run by Gerald Winrod, otherwise known as the Jayhawk Nazi, who was a Nazi from Kansas and a minister. So almost all of these other, the American Opinion was the John Birch Society. So all of these were kind of conspiratorial, far right, implicitly, if not explicitly, kind of anti-Semitic pieces of information that the mainstream press and the political world paid almost no attention to. Everybody talked about Bill Buckley, right? Bill Buckley was the face of conservatism, the editor of the National Review. But in many ways, what's interesting is Walter Huss could have cared less about Bill Buckley. In fact, the only time Bill Buckley ends up in Walter Huss's archives are when a friend of his in 1990 sends him a letter that he wants to get to Bill Buckley because he's concerned that Bill Buckley doesn't understand the extent to which the Jews run everything and that they are really the problem. And so this friend wants Walter Huss to try to get Bill Buckley to pay attention because he's surprised that Bill Buckley, being the good conservative patriot that he is, doesn't understand what this person has discovered about the international Jewish conspiracy. Okay, so to wrap up, this is a list of all of the things, the policy positions that Huss would have had from 1960 to 2006. Now, most of these Republicans like Mark Hatfield or Bob Packwood would not have really agreed with. I think you would be hard-pressed to find a contemporary far-right Republican or even moderate Republican now who doesn't agree with all of these things. And this was the way Huss saw the world from start to finish. He was a gun rights absolutist, anti-abortion, anti-feminist, opposed to sex ed in schools because he thought they tolerated homosexuality. He was staunchly anti-immigrant, especially immigrants from nations with people of color. He wanted to abolish the IRS. He was a states' rights advocate who opposed all federal regulation. He thought universities were factories of communist brainwashing. He was very pro-police. He opposed every effort to create community oversight boards or other ways to limit the discretion of police. He wanted to defund public schools and divert those funds into Christian schools. He thought civil rights activists were, quote, race hustlers and anti-white racists. In his world, there were racists in America, but all of them were people of color who talked about racism, was what he saw as the problem of racism. And he distrusted the mainstream media and instead chose to trust conspiratorial media that frankly lied to him, like the Spotlight and so on, and took advantage of his credulity, just as he took advantage of the credulity of other people in order to try to make money for himself. Right. And then another piece of this is that I want to emphasize the extent to which Huss's papers reveal this really pretty extensive network of other folks who agreed with him, with whom he shared his anti-Semitic ideas, and they reciprocated in kind. One of them is this man named Edward Heyman, who is an obscure Gladstone preacher who ran, summer Bible camps and so on for kids in Gladstone, Oregon, and also was in the Posse Comitatus and worried about the communist Jews taking over the world and had ties to the Aryan nation. Another is Betty Froith, who worked as a docent for many years at the Oregon State Capitol, right across the street from where I am right now. And were you to see her, she would look as a kind of beehive hairdo wearing nice older woman, who also happened to believe that Hitler was one of the good guys like Jesus. And she was the chair of the Marion County Republican Party in the early 1980s. She corresponded a lot with Huss. She was the secretary of the Oregon Republican Party in the mid 80s when Dermot O'Scanlan was the chair. She was sitting right next to him as he was leading the meetings. And so Huss is not alone in these things that he believed. So to conclude, so while most journalists and Republican politicians in Oregon dismissed Huss as a kook, his papers are filled with correspondence from his fellow anti-Semites who regarded him as a brave, truth-telling Christian patriot who was being victimized and silenced by the vast Jewish communist conspiracy that he and they were determined to overthrow. And so one can understand why establishment Republicans would want to distance themselves from someone like that. But I think it's also important to note that in doing that, they kind of failed to really come to terms with the extent to which Huss was not some weird lone wolf with some kooky ideas that he just cooked up in his brain, sitting alone in his house at 23rd and Belmont. This was part of a much broader kind of political mobilization happening on the far right that is still with us today.
Applause from the audience.
Thank you. I also want to say, if anyone has stories they would like to share with me of any experience they had with Walter Huss, or anything they know about him, or in any way that he was a figure in your life that you knew of, either personally or just as by reputation, please let me know. I'm eager to gather whatever sort of stories I can from folks about him.
Well, and it sounds like, if I understood correctly, that one of the unanswered research questions remains, how did he get forced out of the chair of the GOP, right? So, you know, when you noted that, I thought, oh, maybe somebody on the call here has some insight into that.
I would love that. Yeah.
Yeah, please, folks have been doing a great job putting some really excellent questions into the Q&A. We're seeing those. Please continue to do that. And I think something that you started to touch on there as you were wrapping up is sort of, who were his, not necessarily followers, but sort of what was his constituency, right? And you were touching on that a little bit, that he and others who held these extreme views were sitting alongside what at the time might have been considered more mainstream members of the parties, but really, you know, sometimes literally right next to each other. Is
Right.
there a sort of breakdown of how many Oregonians were with him on this side of things, or?
So it's hard because there's a great line from Howard Phillips, who was another kind of far right activist in the 80s and 90s. And he described what he did as, we organized discontent, is what he said. And that was basically what Walter Huss did, right? So for example, around the AIDS crisis and the gay rights struggle in Portland in the 80s, what Walter Huss did is he tapped into people who were kind of anxious about the visibility of gay people in Portland, and maybe parents who had kids in schools who, you know, had heard some rumors about, you know, gay teachers or whatever, and Huss would latch onto that, right? And you didn't have to buy the whole store, you know, you didn't have to buy all of the conspiracy theories. You just had to buy the one that resonated with you. So similarly, with the MLK, his effort to take Martin Luther King Jr.'s name off of MLK Boulevard in 1989 and 90, what he did is he tapped into anti-City Hall sentiment. And he framed it as, these bureaucrats in City Hall just decided to change the name of a street. And did they ask you? No. So these out of control bureaucrats who decide, hey, this isn't about racism or anything. You know, this is just about, you know, the procedure. And so he would play that kind of populist role. And an interesting note about that, his cover was blown when in January of 1990, one of the nation's leading white power, white nationalists came to Oregon to support the cause. And he had dinner at the Huss's house. And then this was reported in the Oregonian. And so that kind of blew the cover on whether this had anything to do with racism. But the Husses continued to protest that, oh, no, he was just a visitor to town. We were just being friendly. Just because you have someone over for dinner doesn't mean you agree with them entirely. This has nothing to do with racism. And by the way, did you notice that the editor of the Oregonian is Black? And maybe that's why they're talking about it, was the response on the part of the Husses, right?
That's interesting. There's a follow-up question about, was, you know, this sort of using discontent, did he use this effort to recruit more people? You know, did he get names and contacts and that kind of thing through this effort to reverse the community-led process to rename for Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard?
Yes, if there's any intrepid researcher out there who would like to use it, in a box in his archives, there is the entire list of everybody who donated money to his cause. Yeah. And so, yes, I mean, and what's interesting is that a significant, and he maintained a mailing list as well. So when he ran for governor in 1998, he shared a mailing list with a PR company that had hundreds, maybe thousands of names on them. And so, yes, he did very much try to cultivate. He was an organizer, you know, and a lot of the ways that he did that was through church networks and through other ministers, even though he was never in charge of a church after 1956. He very much had a public persona as a Foursquare minister. At one point, the Foursquare church had to say to him, stop calling yourself a minister because you're being too political and we don't want to take sides in all of this. But he very much played up that part of who he was. So he was very good at building those networks, and he was also very good at reaching out to business people and other just kind of like, angry, pissed off, resentful Portlanders, who just didn't like what Bud Clark was doing, or just didn't like what the state government was doing in terms of taxes. And he would tap into that and get people engaged in this kind of populist form of conservative politics that was very distinct from the more kind of moderate institutionalist mode of someone like a Tom McCall or Mark Hatfield or Bob Packwood.
And so to go to the other end of things, how was Huss, is radicalized the right term? Someone noted that he served in World War II. Did he serve in? Which theater did he serve in? And because he became a Holocaust denier, I'm sure that stood out for a lot of folks. So where did these extreme views come from for Walter Huss?
I wish I knew. So he served in the Pacific Theater. And he was in the engineering corps. So he never saw combat, as far as I know. There's in the 1930s. So Huss was born in 1918. So when he was 20, in his neighborhood in Portland, there were active silver shirt cells that were active. I have no idea whether he was involved with them or not. But Mike Beach, who is one of the kind of originators of the Posse Comitatus movement in the 1970s, was in Portland in the 1930s, organizing the silver shirts, and then and so there are these genealogical ties that connect the kind of patriot far-right groups of the 70s and 80s to the fascist organizations of the 1930s. So it might have happened there. It might have happened at the church in Los Angeles in the 1940s, where there was a lot of kind of Christian identity theology being articulated. I'm hoping to learn more. I mean, his papers are very heavily weighted from the 70s on. There isn't a lot of material before the 1970s. So I'm going to have to try to see if I can track him down in other archives.
I just want to make sure you note there's a note in the chat that is giving appreciation for the thoroughness of your research. And so I'm sure that person is not the only one who's grateful for that. I do just want to, clarify, because there are a couple of questions about the silver shirts and Posse Comitatus and his direct connections to both. It sounds like what you found is that he's adjacent to these leaders and these groups, but there's not clarity on any causal relationship between him and them, or even membership or that kind of thing. Do you know yet?
So part of the way that these groups worked is that they didn't keep official membership roles, right?
Yeah.
So Laverne Hollaback was one of the leaders of the Posse Comitatus movement in Portland, and Huss has a folder of Laverne Hollaback that has many records of his phone conversations with him and other correspondence between him and Laverne. So it's clear that he and Laverne knew each other quite well and were on very amicable, positive terms. He wasn't like surveilling Laverne to be sure that he wasn't doing anything bad by him. And in that letter with Edward Heyman, who I mentioned before, what comes out in that letter are the ways in which in 1988 he and Heyman were on the same page in terms of who they saw as the good guys and the bad guys. And Heyman was an active participant in the Posse Comitatus movement who engaged in armed conflict. In 1966, Huss and a guy named Everett Thorin ran together, and Thorin was running for Republican House in Eastern Oregon. He failed. Thorin was a kind of conservative Republican in the late 60s. By 1977, he's the guy that is responsible for that attack on the potato shed out in Eastern Oregon. There's this big conflict. So Everett Thorin is the guy behind that, who is also a friend of Huss's going back into the 60s. And then up into the 80s, Heyman and Huss are corresponding about Everett Thorin and how they really want to listen into his Bible justice talks about. So in that sense, I found no evidence that Huss saw some Posse Comitatus activity and was like, oh, that's bad. One thing I did note is that apparently in his FBI file, which according to the FBI has been destroyed, but Huss himself noted in a conversation with his wife in a phone conversation with his wife that his FBI file described him as a Nazi and a member of the Posse Comitatus.
Oh, how interesting.
So he had the information. He was informed that the FBI this was in 1985, that he was concerned that the FBI had identified him as a member of the Nazi Party and the Posse Comitatus. And when he wrote, that's all he wrote down. I found no evidence that he denied that or found that to be problematic. I think he probably was scared that, you know, the Jewish conspiracy through the FBI and the deep state was going to get him, right? Was out to get him.
Yeah.
And that's why it was an object of concern.
I want to ask you to talk a little bit more about violence. And I think, you know, when we think about violence, there's a question about his specific connection to the neo-Nazi skinhead groups who were in Portland in the 1980s. Of course, the murder of Mulugeta Serra is one of the most extreme examples of that violence. And there's also a question in more generally, you know, about his connection to violent groups. And I just want to ask you to talk to us about that, both in the sort of explicit, active, physical violence, but also thinking about the sort of violence of instigation or institutional violence that might be part of this as well. I realize that's big. I just want you to think about it that way.
Yeah, no, that's great. So Eleanor Langer has that great book about the murder of Mulugeta Serra and so on. And she was generous enough to speak with me about it. And she had never heard of, Huss was just a kind of vague figure that she knew about. And so she never ran across any connection in her incredibly thorough research that linked Huss to the skinheads. And I have not found anything either, other than one pamphlet from the Northwest Imperative that was in his papers. But they lived in the same neighborhood, right? I mean, the skinheads were all there on, you know, in the 20s and 30s and Southeast Hawthorne. And so they inhabited the same exact neighborhood. But I've yet to find anything that ties him to those groups. I suspect that he was just a little too kind of nerdy and Christian for them, right? That they probably regarded him as kind of an old fuddy-duddy. But in the 90s, in the 90s, he did get involved with Bo Greitz and some of the kind of militia types. So he went to a training session with Bo Greitz to learn how to shoot and how to bulletproof his house and how to do karate. This was when he was in his early 70s. And so he was prepared for violence. I found no evidence that he engaged in any himself. And from what I've heard from other people, the impression I get is that he was smart enough to recognize that that would be disqualifying, right? And so like his response to those neo-Nazis, for example, like Edward Crump, in 1965. I mean, those were violent men who engaged in violent acts towards people of color, towards Jewish people, et cetera. And Huss would have undoubtedly known that. But he neither condoned it nor condemned it. He just kind of chose to try to keep himself separate from it. Another example is that in 1979, when he was the chair of the party, one day, people arrived at work at the Oregon State Capitol and found copies of the Thunderbolt, which was a white power publication, under every door of every member of Congress in the state capitol. It just so happens that Huss was in Salem that day for a hearing. Was Huss involved in this act of sort of putting white power literature? And he had ties to the National States Rights Party that went back to the 60s, right? So there's all kinds of circumstantial evidence that would tie him to this act of, you know, really violent intimidation. But I can't, beyond that, I can't say. That's all the evidence.
So it's interesting, right? The rhetoric that's adjacent to these really physically violent people sharing rhetoric, but he maybe not taking those acts. Also, the folks are wanting to pick up on one of the threads that you touched on, which is his health care or, you know, health treatment grift, perhaps. Is there a connection between this and his religious work or beliefs? Can you just say more about this aspect of his life?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say. I mean, this was a huge part. This probably next to his anti-Semitism, his anti-establishment ideas about medicine are absolutely central. And a lot of this came out of the Spotlight, which was this far-right newspaper that circulated all kinds of conspiracy theories about how, you know, cancer treatments, whatever it might be, and the latest quack cure, you know, the latest supplement that you can buy that will bring you eternal health and life and so on. And to me, what makes that, the connection between that between that and the politics are the ways in which it's kind of drawing on this sense of like, they are all lying to you. And here is someone who is completely telling you the truth, right? And so be completely skeptical about, you know, the New York Times, the Oregonian, et cetera, but just read the Spotlight with utter credulity, right? Like there's no way the Spotlight would ever lie to me. And all I have to do is send them $50 for these supplements that will enable me to live forever. Awesome, right? But why should I trust what the Oregonian has to say about, you know, the complexities of public health or whatever it might be? So, and that's a space where, especially in the context of Portland in the 1980s and 90s, the politics of it get a lot more complicated and messy, right? Like part of the reason why Portland doesn't have fluoridated water has to do with folks like Huss, but it also has to do with folks who self-identify as people on the left. You know, there was a lot of really healthy, positive skepticism about organized professional medicine that came out, say, for example, Our Bodies, Ourselves, right? And the sort of feminist health movement of the 70s and 80s. So, you know, I wouldn't want to say that like being skeptical about modern medicine is bad, is inherently right-wing or is anti-Semitic. In Huss's case, it was connected to that. And there's a fascinating moment that happens on Southeast Belmont in the early 90s, where there's a guy named Ace Hayes, who was the editor of the Portland Free Press, who was very much a leftist, who distrusted modern medicine, distrusted the CIA, distrusted the FBI, distrusted the federal government. And he gave these seminars called the Secret Government Seminars. They've been recorded. You can see some of them on YouTube if you want. And where he talks about, you know, the international conspiracy of American globalism and imperialism, and he's coming at this from the left. Well, what started happening in 1991, 92 is that all these skinheads and other right-wing people, and maybe Walter Huss, I don't know, I would love to believe that he did, showed up to these talks and were standing in the back going like, yeah, you bet, Ace Hayes. Yeah, let's talk more about the Israeli army and like how the American government is beholden. Yeah, let's do that. And Ace Hayes is kind of sitting in the front like, whoa, wait a minute. Like, wait, you agree with me? Hang on, I'm not with you. Like, I don't agree with you. But these weird coalitions of kind of a populist, anti-establishment politics play out right there between 29th and 23rd on Southeast Belmont in Portland in the 80s and 90s.
Oh, that's amazing. I know we're just past 1 o'clock. So I'm gonna combine a couple questions and ask one final one as we stay on for a few minutes. But I do just want to recognize someone in the chat who worked with the Coalition for Human Dignity for a lot of years, says thank you, and that you've put together a lot of information. And we'll just also express our thanks to you, listener, for your work with the Coalition for Human Dignity. That's really fantastic. So there's a few questions that had to do with Huss's legacy, so to speak. One is familial. Did he have kids? And if so, did you speak with family members? But then also the sort of political legacy. Specifically, did he have any connection with Prop 13, the cutting of taxes, or was that Measure 5 in Oregon? You know the one we're talking about, the 1990s huge tax cut measure that came in right as Barbara Roberts came in. But then also, does he have any influence, him in particular, on the current extreme right-wing politics in Oregon or nationwide? So this is a whole bunch of legacy questions all wrapped into one for you.
Yeah, and sorry, remind me of his family. So first of all, his family, he had 7 children. They all appeared to have really hated and resented him, from what I've seen in the archive. There's some really personal things in the archive that I don't think he intended to be saved, but which are there. It's clear that his children did not have a very positive experience growing up in his household. And he, of course, was very punishing and resentful of them for the way they, as he saw it, treated him unfairly. So there isn't a lot of family legacy, and I've not been able to track down. I think there's only one surviving child, and I'm ambivalent. I mean, I started as an early American historian, so the idea that there might be living people who I could interview for a research project is strange to me. And I'm slightly ambivalent about it just in the sense that I can understand why this child would be nervous about her family becoming public. There's that. And so that's his only, like, it's not like he had kids who went into politics or anything like that, that it doesn't go anywhere beyond that. And in terms of, I mean, I think if you asked most contemporary Republicans and said the name Walter Huss to them, they wouldn't know his name. I think very few people would recognize him. There are a few kind of people in their 70s and 80s who are still, so I spoke with a significant number of former Republicans, most of them were former Republicans, who were the sorts of people who really disliked Huss. Most of them are no longer Republicans, or if they are sort of moderate Republicans who don't support Donald Trump. There are some Republicans, however, who I've identified. Betty Froif is an example of someone who left the Republican Party in the early 2000s. She thought they were just completely liberal and communist. And then when Donald Trump emerged, she was super excited. And so as far as Betty Froif was concerned, Donald Trump was finally the arrival of the Republican Party that she had been hoping for since the 1980s when she became politically active. And she's just one of a few people who I've identified who were kind of co-workers with Huss in his brand of Republican politics in the 80s, who today are very excited about where the Republican Party is currently. So, I mean, I think we can never know, but my guess is if Walter Huss had lived to see Donald Trump, that he would be thrilled. I think he would be absolutely, and again, this doesn't, right, I mean, take that for what you want about what it says about Donald Trump and what he thinks. But I think in terms of, I mean, Walter Huss, his political heroes were first Goldwater, and then George Wallace in 1968, and then Ronald Reagan. He was a really enthusiastic backer of Ronald Reagan in the 80s, and then Dan Quayle in the early 90s. And then after that, he started to kind of get disenchanted. George H.W. Bush, to him, was a little soiled by his connection to the Trilateral Commission and other kind of globalists. And by the 90s, Huss is in a really just dark conspiratorial rabbit hole of a place.
Oh, this is so fascinating. We should end now because we've kept everyone long, but I want to say thank you very much to the audience for amazing comments, amazing questions. Thank you, Amber Curson from OJMCHE, for keeping us on track. And I think she's going to, if she has it, is going to post your contact information for people who might want to reach out with additional information. And I'm sure you're easy to find through Willamette University. Thanks, Judy Margles, and everyone at OJMCHE for your leadership and your work on this program. Professor Cotlar, we will be looking forward to learning more from your research. Follow him on Twitter if you don't already. And hopefully we'll see you all next week for the next in our series. So thanks everyone and have a wonderful afternoon.